Greetings, folks. Nice to see you today. My name is Dustin Cormier, and this is How to Rock Astrology. Today, I'm going to be starting a new part of this series. This series is entitled, What Are the Nakshatras? Eventually, I'm going to be getting specifically into each nakshatra. But first, I want to give a background picture of the mythos of what the nakshatras are historically and what they mean to us now in the modern context as tropical Vedic astrologers. I do have a bias towards tropical astrology. I'm a student of Ryan Kirksack's in his Asheville Vedic astrology program, and that is the bias that I go by in my astrological practice. Is I use Western measurements using the tropical derivations of the rashis, or the signs, and I still consider the nakshatras and all other things Vedic astrology to be relevant and important in interpreting a natal chart. Now, the author, Radhe, she is a sidereal Rashi advocate. This is Radha. She hails from the tradition of Jyotisha, typical of the sidereal Rashi camp. I'm going to say a little bit about her, but just to explain my own bias, I am an astrologer who... I'm a tropical Vedic astrologer, and our author today uses the sidereal Rashis. So she is one who considers, for example, that Ashwini starts at 0 degrees of Aries, and so on and so forth. Now, I really am, part of my insistence in my whole shtick is to explain that there is wisdom in these old texts that talk about the nakshatras, even if they don't belong in the same camp of interpreting the data. You know, most sidereal astrologers bring the signs back 24 degrees, which tropical astrologers think is bogus because we abide by the precession of the equinox. If you want to learn more about this, check out earlier in the series. But Radha's information is still well grounded in scriptural classifications, and she still gives a very deep, very astute, very well-researched glimpse into the mythos, the character, and the arc field of the nakshatras. And she also has a unique description for interpreting planets that fall into these nakshatras, which we're going to get into eventually. For now, today's episode we're going to give her written preface on the book, as well as talking a little bit about her. So, Radha is professionally trained in Ayurveda and Jyotisha. She specializes in Jyotisha, the integration of Ayurvedic consultation, and a natal chart reading. She also conducts workshops in Ayurveda, Jyotisha, and the Vedic scriptures. She was educated at the Ayurvedic Institute of New Mexico, Gurukula Ayurveda program in India, Harvard Business School, MBA, and the University of Southern California, where she got a Bachelor of Arts. So good education. I believe that she is essentially a English American. And so she is somebody who does really take all of this from a Western academic perspective, although she really has deep guts into the sense of what the nakshatras are all about. She had a teacher who gave her guidance in this regard. She also she notes the influence of Ganesha in her divine acknowledgments. Basically, she has many people who she acknowledges who were Western authors and translators as well. So this is a lady who we have to consider is just very academically minded and does some very deep research into what the scriptures say about these nakshatras and how they manifest. And that is her essential shtick. Now, we're going to get into her preface right now without further ado, just so you can see her description of what this book is all about before we get into the legitimate introduction of the book. So this is the preface of this present edition, which is called The Divine Forces of the Lunar Nakshatras, as portrayed in the Vedas, which is a big part of her shtick. She starts by saying, the divinely cognized Rig Veda is the earliest codification of India's spiritual antiquity, and it is the heart and soul of India's mystical heritage. Each of one of the Rig Veda's over 1,000 hymns, or shuktas, is composed as a sacred verse, a rik, an adornment and celebration of the Vedic godheads. Hence, the mystical wisdom, or vidya, of the Rig Veda is cloaked in the sacred garb of the Devatas, their characterization, their special faculties, their sacerdotal roles, and legendary feats. So much of the wisdom of the Rig Vedas in ancient India come through the archetypal mythos of these 33 gods. The 33 gods which eventually siphoned down to the 27 nakshatras. The impetus for publishing this book, The Divine Forces of the Lunar Nakshatras, was the realization that this ancient scripture is the birthplace of the nakshatra devatas and the wellspring for their many Puranic legends. The Puranas were a stream of scriptures and sacred writings that poured like dew from the river of the Rig Veda. In the present volume, the Divine Forces of the Lunar Nakshatras, the author shares the profundity of the nakshatra devatas as first revealed in this nearly 6,000-year-old text. This novel approach distinguishes the work from all others currently available on the subject. Radha's journey into India's literary past concerned not only the Rig Veda, but also the Yajur Veda, accompanying Brahmanas, and the Atharva Veda. The Yajur Veda and Brahmanas contain rare representations of the nakshatra devatas as vital participants in the Brahmanic sacrificial ceremonies known as yagnas. This is a huge part of the mythos, and really there's this incredible incineration sacrifice ceremony nestled into the consciousness of all things Vedic, and particularly in the consciousness of the nakshatras. If you understand the old Brahman sacrifice, then you understand the essence of the 27 nakshatras and the narrative that they represent. In another Veda, the Atharva Veda, the first medical text of India, the nakshatra devatas are revered within the context of illness, disease, and possession by spirits. As my journey into the ancient scriptures progressed, the veil covering the mysterious nakshatra devatas slowly lifted. New implications, both gross and subtle, were divulged. Just as importantly, many nakshatra significations, as advocated by others, were at last anchored in Scripture. Still, answers to several questions remained in the background as light not yet witnessed by the author in her journey. She asked herself, what interrelationships exist between the various nakshatra devatas? Devatas meaning devas and gods. Is there a divine order to this seemingly random pantheon of gods? How are the Nakshatra Devatas to be distinguished from the other 33 million gods of India? My interest in such questions soon turned into a quest. It became evident early on that the source of the answers, the scriptures themselves, were fraught with corruption, inconsistency, and erroneous translations. Not to mention personal liberties taken by several translators throughout history. This is, of course, the problem very much with modern qualification of any nakshatra. All of the scriptures have the possibility of various sorts of erroneous translation and inconsistency, and personal liberty taken by translators. We know this is especially so in the context of tropical astrology. Part of the issue that we're trying to clarify with this series is that tropical astrology has determined that the nakshatras are not married to the rashis. So many of these old texts and many people's translated interpretations of the nakshatras include an interwoven marriage of the nakshatra with its sign, which from 3,000 years ago, there was an interrelationship of these signs. But now, for example, we know that the sign of Ashwini, which was once correlated with the sign of Aries, it's now at the tail end of Aries. And like Revati, for example, or Bharani, used to also be considered to be in Aries, but is now in the sign of Taurus. So many of the descriptions of the nakshatras throughout history, especially in medieval times, have this the bias of the author's personal liberty. Them intuiting, yes, this nakshatra Bharani seems to be in Aries 3,000 years ago. So maybe Bharani has some essence of Aries in it. Now we know in modern tropical astrology that Bharani is in Taurus, and whatever qualities that was assigned to Bharani that related to Aries is now irrelevant. We as modern astrologers have to, unfortunately, we got to do some old digging and listen to the translations of old authors and bleach to the bones the essence of the nakshatra while removing the impurity of the association with rashis. The present author has done a little bit of digging for us in this regard, but she is still a sidereal author, and her derivations will still contain some bias. We have to be careful of this, but she does a good job of trying to really isolate the character of the nakshatra from the Rashi implications, because she gets it from the Vedas, the Puranic texts, which were there before Parashara and before Parashara and the houses and the typical astrology that we know today. The common practice of using multiple appellations for a god, Radhe says. Sorry. Radha continues. The common practice of using multiple appellations for a god, depending on the particular scripture or divine feature being emphasized, only added to the confusion. For example, Brahaspati, it's the lord of Brahman, it's the translation of it, which is really Jupiter in a lot of ways. Brahaspati, lord of the Brahman, is lauded as Vasatkara, the caller of the Vasat, and Vakaspati, master of speech. Now, Indra, the best or most excellent, that's what the name Indra translates as. Indra is famous as Shakra, the powerful or strong. Maghavan, the bountiful or liberal. And Harivarpas, the golden-formed. So the fact that the Rig Vedas use various appellations or names for these same gods makes things hairy and confusing. What nakshatra are they talking about? And, sometimes the gods, the deities, are interspersed throughout. Some gods or deities are interspersed throughout several nakshatras, including Agni being involved in Kritika as well as Vishaka, which is Agni, Indragni, meaning Vishaka is a combination of Indra and Agni. So there's many references to the gods in different ways with different qualities throughout the Rig Vedas. This adds to our confusion. Sparing the reader the bewilderment and endless hair-splitting endured by the author, Radhe, the divine forces of the Lunar Nakshatras presents conclusions arrived at after years of research, investigation, and contemplation. Uniquely, the divine forces of the Lunar Nakshatras presents novel theories, ancient scripture citations, and original manuscripts never before published for the Jyotisha community. In most cases, the portrayal, mystical powers, epithets, and legends of the Nakshatra Devatas are traced from the Rig Veda to the Yajur Veda and supporting Brahmanas, to the Puranas and Itihasas, or the epic legends. Included are Radha's personal interpretations of the mythological legends, along with their suggested relevancy to Jyotisha in the reading of the birth chart. Very useful. It is my sincere hope that the divine forces of the Lunar Nakshatras facilitates the reader's own connection with the Nakshatra Devatas, invoking an inner awakening to their multitude of other Jyotisha significations. Importantly, there are no singularly correct interpretations of such material. In their profundity, myths and symbols hold a multitude of truths and a diversity of meanings. It's a cool attitude. Lastly, a nice little note that I'm glad that the author adds in here. I have elected not to follow the traditional sequential review of the nakshatras. Although more convenient, quote-unquote, I'll explain what she means here. The approach of following the traditional sequential review of the nakshatras, it masks the interrelatedness of the nakshatra devatas and fails to illuminate critical classifications. What she's saying here is that she actually begins her review of the nakshatra devatas by beginning at Kritika, ruled by the god of Agni. As well, she gives a little bit of a derivation, her own little intro, and then she begins talking about Kritika. This is a very important point for anybody who's considering what I keep saying is the bias of tropical Vedic astrology, which is the camp that I consider myself to be in. Because in old days, Ashwini was considered the first nakshatra because it related to the Rashi, or the sign, of Aries. Now we know that derivation of Ashwini as the first nakshatra is totally arbitrary. And the real classical tradition upholds that Kritika begins the series of the nakshatras. And this includes the very important text, the Taittiriya Brahmana, which is where Ernst Wilhelm and Victor get their derivation of the energies of the 27 lunar mansions. This is Ernst Wilhelm's book. So that's a wonderful thing, and that was one of the clues that got me into this book, Radha, as a describer of the nakshatra qualities. So it's going to be a good run, folks. I'm going to do the intro, and then the next few episodes, I'm going to be doing the intro from this book, introducing the book, and then we're going to finish, before we get into the individual nakshatras, we're going to finish with an introduction to Ernst Wilhelm's book, as well as to Victor 27 Lunar Nakshatras and Gods. So thank you for watching, folks. This is Dustin Cormier. You're watching How to Rock Astrology. See you on the next episode. We're going to really get into the guts of how Radhe conceives of the nakshatras and their qualities. Thanks for watching.